Thank you guys for joining us on this webinar. This is one of 3 days. My name is Gregory Vidal. I am the Director of Clinical Research at the West Cancer Center Research Institute in Memphis, Tennessee. I lead the breast cancer program and also an associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Tennessee, but enough about me. I want to really thank you all, the faculty and participants, for joining us there for the first of 3-day webinar session entitled Diversity in Cancer Care, where we seek to elevate and highlight the power of diversity in many aspects of the cancer continuum with the goal of equality and equity in cancer. Um, I want to put a plug for the next 3 days. Tomorrow we'll be talking about clinical care, and the next day there will be a fireside chat with advocates, healthcare leaders, and practitioners. On our panel today, we're discussing diversity in clinical trial. We have Dr. Arturo Loaiza-Bonilla. I'm sorry if I'm messing up your name, from the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, Dr. Dorff from City of Hope, and Dr. Porter from the West Cancer Center. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, their expertise, and tell us very shortly why they chose research as an integral part of their career. Dr. Loaiza-Bonilla, can you?
Yes, thank you so much for having me today and for the rest of the panel. So we'll hopefully have a good discussion. I'm a medical oncologist. I specialize in GI malignancies. And the enterprise director of research at Cancer Treatment Centers of America, currently located in Atlanta. My impetus in being part of research and clinical trials have come from the beginning of medical school. I always wanted to do research, and that's the reason why I came to the US after training in Colombia. But something that really struck me was I had a personal situation. My brother had leukemia when I was in training, and I found it extremely difficult to find clinical trials for him and navigate, that part of the experience, even for folks who have the privilege, such as ourselves, to understand what we're doing, right? So for me was, a call to action to really help my patients as much as possible and as many as we can, particularly for the Hispanic population. We see those dismal numbers, something that I really felt passionate about. So working from the, precision medicine, and also thinking about social determinants of health as, personalized medicine for our patients. So that's just a quick summary of why I chose to be in this pathway, and appreciate everyone's here today.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Me, myself, my mom had leukemia, and that's what brought me into the field. So that's a very similar story. Dr. Porter, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Jason Porter. I'm here in Memphis, Tennessee at the West Cancer Center and Research Institute. I'm a native Memphian, and we have a really large minority population. Our minority population is not really minority in Memphis. And my mom had cholangiocarcinoma. My dad had lung cancer. And so now I specialize in lung cancer and focus my research efforts in the lung cancer space. And one of the reasons that I'm still in Memphis and practicing here is because of our large minority population and the need to bring clinical trials to the patients here. It's been an interest of mine and a reason for staying in the area. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion tonight, and I'm happy to be on.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dorff?
Hi, I'm Tanya Dorff. I'm a genitourinary medical oncologist at City of Hope. And like all of you, I guess, my mother had leukemia, or 2 out of the 3 of you was leukemia. So why I do clinical trials, her leukemia used to be uniformly fatal. It was APL, a very unique type, but the science, understanding what was happening at the level of the cancer cell, led to a very elegant treatment with all transretinoic acid, and that's very specific to this particular leukemia. And so she is still here today, more than 20 years later. So a fatal disease went to a very curable disease. And I think without clinical trials, we're stuck in that fatal disease setting. We'll always be treating people the same, and we'll never see it get better. So I can't imagine practicing oncology without having clinical trials.
Thank you very much. There is certainly a personal connection with a lot of us, and that's where I guess the dedication comes from. So we're here to discuss diversity in clinical trial. I am just going to put it out there, whoever wants to discuss this first. Tell me, why are we discussing this? What is the scope of the problem? Is there a problem?
Where to start?
Okay. So, Dr. Bonilla, Loaiza-Bonilla, can you tell us the scope of the problem when we talk about clinical trial and inclusion in clinical trial from a diversity perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. As all the other faculty here have discussed, research in clinical trials is the way is the mainstay of development and validation of any new therapies coming to our patients. And despite having access to novel treatments, technologies, less than 1 in 20 adult patients in the United States participate in the clinical trials. So that's dismal on its own. But if we go to looking at minority populations, that disparity is even starker. So for racial and ethnic minorities, the data shows basically that clinical trial enrollment has actually decreased over the past 2 decades. So the problem is real and is getting worse, which is something that we are puzzled about, because at the same time we're hoping that the more access to information, the more access to treatments leads to better participation, but that hasn't been translated into that. So just to give you a quick example, out of the last decade, 12 million people were enrolled, were diagnosed with cancer, and only 0.1% enrolled in trials. Out of those, 70% were not minorities. So African American population was less than 15%. And Hispanic population was about 7 to 10%. So even though all of them represent much more numbers than that percentages that we're talking about, is just tell us that there's a lot of room to grow, and we need to get access so we can promote equity and diversity and equality for everyone.
Thank you very much for that. I always like to say that our clinical trials should really reflect our population. For Black patients, for example, there's 13% of the US population, but only about an average about 5% on our trials. And they all still end up using the same drugs when we don't really understand how it impacts them. Dr. Porter, are all minority groups affected equally when it comes to participation in clinical trials?
No, we know that that's not the case. One thing that I'll use as a reference in non-small cell lung cancer is the EGFR story. And we know that the minority populations are a little bit less likely than, say Asian populations to have an EGFR mutation anyway. So if there's a difference there, there's other differences that aren't being realized or acted upon because of the paucity of minorities in the clinical trials. I think that different things, education, level of education, and other factors play a part in that. Location also will play a part. So if you're in a city that has a lot of larger academic centers, even if you are a minority, you're more likely to be on a clinical trial than a center that doesn't have academic centers or centers participating in clinical research. And so I think location has a big deal it's a big part of it, but I think that the minority populations are not necessarily equally affected. I feel like African Americans and maybe Hispanic Americans probably suffer the most. Asian populations who migrate or come to the United States are more likely to be affluent, more likely to have higher status of education, and so then maybe more likely to be able to access clinical trials than some other populations. So I think all of those factors play a part, and definitely not equally affected by this this unfortunate situation.
Thank you very, very much for that. And you touched on some of the topics that we want to talk about. Dr. Dorff, Dr. Porter talks about socioeconomic reasons and even education reasons. What are some other reasons that you're aware of that's affected in your particular population that affects minority population or underrepresented, underserved populations from participating in trials?
Well, I would say language is a particular barrier, and that affects different populations differently. So you'll find in many clinical trials, there's a Spanish consent, and the quality of life questionnaires are translated into Spanish, but they may not be translated into Korean or Chinese. And so right off the bat, you're excluding patients other than the ones for whom you're willing to translate all your forms, including the informed consent, but well beyond that in modern clinical trials, into additional languages. I also think there are cultural influences in many different populations. There may be different perspectives on how much to trust a Western medicine doctor versus other sources of wisdom related to health or other healthcare practices. So obviously in the African American community, there are particular historical influences on that element of trust that's needed to have a therapeutic relationship, and especially when you go into something experimental like a clinical trial. But I think for other populations also sometimes there's just factors we may not understand about how people have been raised to view doctors and participation in medical research.
Thank you very much. Dr. Loaiza-Bonilla, I do understand from Black population some of the trust issues or other social issues that hinder participation. Are there any sort of specific issues in the Hispanic/Latin population that we don't quite know about that you think would hinder participation?
Yes, indeed. So I think, as was mentioned by Dr. Dorff, language is a major barrier. Many patients with, Hispanic patients with cancer, first of all, they wait too long typically to get seen and get screened. So typically they have, very advanced cancers when they're found. So that's one major barrier. They're very attached to the local community. So travel is always an issue for many of them. They rather feel comfortable where they are. They also have trust issues in terms of reimbursability for clinical trials. If you know, for example, until recently, we didn't have, for example, patients on Medicaid being able to be enrolled in clinical trials because there was no reimbursement. That changed with certain policy made recently. But even with the support, they have a mistrust in a system that's going to supposedly provide them something, but they feel they're going to get a bill. Many of them don't have the access to thousands of dollars just to just travel and get reimbursed. That's another component. And lastly is the element of trust when for their caregivers as well. So many of them are, or including myself, we want our families to be part of the decision-making process. So even though that's inconvenient, that's something that, culturally, that's a major thing. So when, abuelita is sick, then everyone needs to be involved. Just look at this Disney movie now, Encanto, like that just tells you this whole story, how the whole family is involved in a single affair. So the same happens in clinical trials. So getting access in a culturally congruent disposition is key. Having them also understand that there's many options, and going and look for another doctor is not going to jeopardize the relationship, because sometimes they feel that if they go to a clinical trial, they're leaving their doctor, and the doctor's going to be upset at them. So there's just those issues culturally that of attachment that we need to help them to overcome, so we can improve that 1% participation in clinical trials that currently is for Hispanic patients.
Thank you. Dr. Porter, say you have an African-American patient who you think matches a particular clinical trial and may get some benefit off of it, but that patient is hesitant. What techniques have you used to try to educate that patient so that they can make a more educated rather than emotional decision?
One thing I always do is use analogies, and analogies that help the patient relate and understand not only the disease, but the treatment that I'm offering and why it's relevant, what the current standard of care is versus the treatment that I'm offering through the clinical trial. bringing it all the way down to a level where I know that they understand. And it goes so far as to using analogies like, for the immune system, I say it all the time. It's like a foreign invader. Cancer is like an alien, and the immune system not acknowledging it. It's kind of like, living next door to a green person, and they're green, but they're bringing you cookies, so you let them stay there, and you don't call the men in black. So just these analogies where people go, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. Why would I do that? Why would I ever let a green person live in the house next to me and not notify authorities? So then when they kind of have this understanding, it helps them to, not only explain it back to their caregivers and their families, like Dr. Loaiza-Bonilla was saying, so that the other people involved in the decision making with them can understand. But then the patient understands. Another thing I do is I was born here in Memphis and raised here, so most of the cultural barriers that would keep patients from enrolling in those trials, I'm aware of them, and I'll just call them right out to them and say, in our community, it's a big thing to say, oh, I have cancer. I'm not claiming that. And I will just go ahead and say to the patient, I know probably you're not claiming the cancer, and that's okay. And, not to sound blunt, but I will often say, but it's claiming you. And if we don't do something about it, it's going to be fatal. And then it helps patients to kind of just get through all of these initial things. I just go through them step by step, the things that I know are already barriers. Yeah, your aunt had cancer, your dad had cancer, and this is what they experienced. But these treatments now offer these particular side effect profiles that are a lot more manageable, a lot more tolerable. And particularly this trial that I'm offering, the expectation is that the side effect profile is even better. So helping them kind of see through all of those things, because most people will come and say, I'm not doing any chemotherapy. My grandma had chemo. I had one lady tell me my grandma had radiation and she lost her vision. Well, they radiated her whole face, in the 1950s. We're not doing that anymore. And so really just to get on the granular level, write down, where the patient understands and break it down. And it takes time. The visits are longer and you have to be willing to dedicate that time. But as long as you are, a lot of times you can break through those barriers.
How do you address the trust from a historical abuse perspective?
A lot of times I've found myself pointing out the fact that, it's not like we're just putting 100% African Americans on this trial and that, there's no understanding or, transparency about what's going to be given to you, any of those things. This is an international trial. Everybody's getting the same therapy. And, it kind of takes away the mystery. Well, why do you want to do that to me? And it's not, I don't want to do that to you. I kind of want to do that for you. And it's the same thing that I'm doing for my Caucasian patients, for my Asian patients, for my Hispanic patients, so that they don't feel like they're being singled out. But even still, and with all of those techniques and trying all of those things and spending hours in the room with patients and their families, I still get rejections, from a good bit of minorities. If they come in and the first thing they say is, I'm not doing no trial, or I'm not doing a trial, and that's it. And no matter how much you talk and how much you explain, you never really get past that. And unfortunately, sometimes, and it's been a few experiences where I had the patient come back and say, okay, I want to try that now. But now the LFTs are 5 times the upper limit of normal, and the disease has progressed to a point where they're no longer a safe clinical trial candidate. And so trying to get them to understand that, because a lot of times they will even say up front, I don't want to do that now, but I'll think about it later. Helping them to understand that later may be an exclusion because of disease progression, organ dysfunction, or even a limitation on the number of lines of therapy that you can have before you go on that particular trial. So making sure you explain that to them so that they can make an informed decision is important.
I always try to, especially addressing the historical distrust.
Mm-hmm.
I always I try to bring it up, bring it out straight out, and also then let the patient know that this happens, but then these are all of the regulations that were put in place so that this never happens again, and that describing that clinical trial is a very well controlled process. And oftentimes I am able to get some patients understanding. One of my experience is that having family members who don't trust the system influence the decision.
All right.
So cases where you sit down and you discuss the trial with a patient, they seem to understand, they're, leaning towards participating, and then they go home and they come back and they say no. Finding out that there's a family member who influenced that. Dr. Dorff, how do you address those situations? How do you get family members sort of involved in the decision making and educating themselves on what a trial is and how the benefits of it?
Well, I think all of you have presented some really great strategies. I do think it starts with understanding if there are misconceptions or if there is misinformation. One of the most common ones I encounter is that all clinical trials have a placebo. So something as simple as starting out before you get into the weeds of the trial, there is no placebo. I think just offers people comfort. In this trial, everyone will get this treatment, and here's what we're trying to learn. So I think also it's important, if you have a good relationship with the patient and the family, to say, I will still be your doctor on the trial. You don't go to some clinical trial doctor, and you and I will still make decisions that we think are in your best interest. Whether you're on the trial or off the trial, we're going to look at your labs. We're going to see how you're feeling. We're going to decide, do we continue the trial? Do we make a change? So I think helping them understand that they're still the center of their care, and building on the trust that has already been established in the relationship is an important piece. But I think institutions also have to have trusting relationships with communities, and that's something that City of Hope's working on particularly. We have clinical network sites that are in various geographical regions with various populations, and we really try to become part of the community. So for instance, out in Lancaster, before we roll out clinical trials, we're having a town hall so people can ask, why do we need clinical trials? Why can't we just do regular cancer care? What's special about it? What's involved in it? And we can have a dialogue, and then holding things like cancer screenings and educational sessions. I think once people can see that this is an institution that wants to be part of this community, that wants to care for this community, I think having that as a background gets people in the door and is a really important part of the whole equation too.
Yeah, thank you. I want to go back a little bit towards the family involvement in that decision. Loaiza-Bonilla, you were talking about Abuela and everybody else getting involved. How important is it for a physician who is going to discuss with a patient about trial to first figure out who is the decision maker, who influences them, and how important is family in making their decision?
Okay. Yeah, I think just to follow up on Dr. Vidal's question about how important it is for us to read the room. So that's key. So whenever they're coming in, I always see who's taking notes. I ask the patient, okay, tell me who are every single one of the folks coming with you. And I appreciate what you guys are doing. So, but I want to make sure that everyone understands, is anyone else missing? So if you want to be on the line, I mean, I don't mind if they make a call at the same time. So they just put on a speaker so we can talk to them about it. I also have the discussion with the patient and tell them, there's a lot of people in your care, but at the end of the day, it's about you. You're the patient, it's your life. And, you're an adult and you took care of all these people around you. So let's hope that actually, you make your decisions and make it based on your best interests. So when I put it from that perspective, typically things are much smoother. And as you had mentioned earlier, sometimes it's like a family member, a caregiver comes back. And actually had one discussion like that today. I had a patient who Spanish speaker only for the patient, and the daughter wasn't confident about clinical trials being covered. So I had to explain to them that there's no bill, like if you are able to come to see me for a clinic visit, that means that you're allowed to be here for a clinical trial. So anything that we need, we'll help you to understand. And that was the way to get the patient on board finally, because the patient was ready, but the daughter wasn't ready. So it took that conversation to really take place to make sure that the patient was coming in.
I also find sometimes you have to schedule a second meeting to get the right people in the room. If they say, oh, I have a daughter who's a nurse or whatever who lives in somewhere else, and can we schedule a call, like once they've had the informed consent document, and that's going to be the person with all the questions, then taking that extra time, even more time, can be helpful.
And I too will often, go ahead and let's make that phone call while we're here talking. FaceTime, especially with COVID, where we have a limited number of patients coming into the room or relatives coming into the room with the patients. FaceTime has really become a big deal. I'll often have my patients even record the first conversation, and this is standard of care or clinical trial discussions. Just go ahead, take out your phone and record it. That way you don't have, a lack of information when you get back to those people who are helping you make those decisions. Will have access to the conversation, and then that person who may be that decision maker or helping to make that decision can actually listen to the conversation and then formulate questions based on that to come back with the next visit. So the question is, how do we get more minorities to participate, and what can pharma do to kind of help with that? And I think that going outside of, what's the traditional, this institution is known for their research and for the physicians there. They have put out the last 15 papers on non-small cell lung cancer is great. And I don't think necessarily that you need to exclude them, but I think a really big part, and you actually already alluded to this, is making sure that in the community you have partners who are trained and able to carry out the exact same research that can be done in a large, academic center. And so bringing that training is what pharma can do, because a lot of the patients can't get to one of those larger institutions. And even if they have the insurance that will cover it and the ability, they have, advanced cancer, and they don't feel like getting on an airplane and flying, X hundred miles to get to a center that, really the clinical trial it's a great trial, and we're happy for that center to have it, but that trial should be available right down the street. And if there is not a center already able and capable of doing that in any particular region, then we need to work to make sure that we do that, because that is real, equitable healthcare, and making sure that people have access to things. Because I'm gonna tell you what, I don't even want to drive to Nashville, and I don't have cancer that I know of. I don't have an advanced malignancy, and it's everything. My sister lives about 2.5 hours away, and it takes a lot of activation energy for me to actually get up and go see her. I just don't want to do it, and I'm not short of breath, and I don't have a lung mass, So, for those patients, really what pharma could do, and they're doing it. West is here in Memphis, but it's been here for over 4 decades. And so the research infrastructure is stable and it's growing. And so we can say that about West here in Memphis, but what about other areas of the country where there are large minority populations? And it's not just African Americans or Hispanics. What about people who live in areas where they're 100 miles away from their cancer center, and they have to drive 100 miles just to even get the standard of care? Making sure that we equip the practitioners, the physicians within a certain region with the ability to carry out those clinical trials, partner them with a large university that you've already worked with for X number of years. Well, that university has a good reputation for its research. Partner them with those smaller community oncology practices to help them offer some clinical trials. And that may be one way to do it. Let that practice use the university's IRB so that they don't have to, because from an administrative standpoint, that may be, it may be prohibitive. Then maybe they can't just get over the barrier of even having an IRB in their center, So all of these things that pharma could do maybe to help connect smaller practices to larger institutions is really, I think, the way to go next.
So I've been asked a very controversial question about whether the FDA should get involved, should set standards for clinical trial accrual diversity based on the malignancy. So the example that was given is triple negative breast cancer. if there's a disproportionate effect in a population, that population should represent at least 15% of the trial before they'll look at the data. I mean, that's a great question. I think it should be the case, but I think there are some risks to starting to try to put even more barriers to accrual. If we start to say we can only accrue this many of this type and this many of this type of patient, it's already hard to fill trials, and most patients don't go on a trial. So I think there's some risk, and so I'm not sure, how that could be done in a way that would be helpful and appropriate and productive without hurting what is already, a very difficult endeavor to get a clinical trial accrued.
Yeah, and I can comment on that too. So I think the role that I envision regulatory agencies such as the FDA is not necessarily to establish quotas of how many patients they need for one or the other, but more incentivize the process. So, for example, they talk to the pharmaceutical company and say, okay, if you have a diversity plan in place for this clinical trial that you want to get approval for at the end of the phase 3, then we want to consider this as the criteria being met as long as you have that in place. So kind of like incentivize it, but not necessarily putting numbers because it's very hard already, and people will not follow those rules because life is complicated. So we don't even have a control of how the patient is going to make a decision today in front of us, much less control exactly the number of patients that can be brought to a specific study based on ethnicity or how they identify themselves. So that's something that I feel we should, there's a framework they published, which I think is great, talk about decreasing costs, improving access, making studies more available in local communities, and develop materials that are more specific to the population. And that's probably a right framework. I wouldn't want to push it further than that, but I would say more to incentivize the industry so they can get those solutions in place, because there's a lot of things in written, but nothing in action.
Thank you very much. I do agree that there has to be some incentive, and that probably putting quota is not the right way to do it. So COVID has impacted everything that we do in healthcare, not only healthcare, but all of our lives. One of the things that happened very early from clinical trial is a lot of trials shut down. A lot of trials put recruitment on halt. Monitoring of trials was also an issue because usually those were done in person. Do you think virtual platforms have a role in clinical trial, and should we be updating that process? It seems like clinical trial, what we did in the 1970s is the same thing that we do now. It's all paper, and signature. Should we then be updating what we do, and would that then have an impact on recruitment from a diverse population? Dr. Dorff, you smile really heavily on that, so I'm going to give that to you.
Yeah, I think telemedicine became a tool available to us because of COVID, and many sponsors actually did adapt and said, okay, if this visit is a safety visit and they can have local labs drawn and you can do a telemedicine checkup on them, that's one less visit for them to drive into the cancer center. I think we need to capitalize on the momentum that not everything has to be so burdensome on the patients, and that will of course facilitate accrual from more distant communities and from patients who have complex family lives and can't come to the cancer center every day or every other day the way some of the trials require, right? There's mobile phlebotomy now. I mean, let's leverage some of this technology to make it easier for patients to participate, because I do think we place too many burdens. And I look to Young Lung as a real example of how research can be done leveraging the technology of the internet. I don't know if Dr. Porter wants to talk more on that, but
yeah,
it is possible.
Could you expand on the Young Lung, either one of you?
So it was a collaboration online so that instead of recruiting people's samples to look at DNA sequencing only from the people that live in the 20-mile radius around my cancer center, anyone could log in to the portal who was diagnosed with lung cancer at a young age and sign up and do their cheek swab or whatever the testing was and send it into the central site. And then they could collect from such a diverse population.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I was going to say, this is not about young lung, but since we like mobile phlebotomy, another thing that we do, we monitor QT intervals and all of these things. And we have these Apple Watches and all of these things that we use now that can like really report back to, your computer. And you could send, there's no need to come in for an EKG even, so a lot of the things that we're doing, like you said, Dr. Vidal, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, we can let that go. Let's push forward with the technology that's been made available to us. And it would actually increase clinical trial enrollment, I'm pretty sure,
So I can foresee difficulties with that because on trials the particular CT scan that you use have to be approved. You couldn't use any phlebotomy, and those have to be so standardized. We have to really let go of that crutch in order to make that happen. Dr. Loaiza-Bonilla, you were going to say something?
Yes, so I think as we mentioned that there's a lot of new developments because of COVID. So some of the silver linings of this tragedy, and one of them is decentralized clinical trials and just-in-time trial designs. So just-in-time, for those in the audience who are not familiar with that, is that we have clinical trials kind of on hold, and we only push the button to start once the first patient is fully eligible coming in. And it's available at many places and sites. So that's one thing. The other ones are decentralized clinical trials, and that's basically the patient doesn't have to move, they don't have to change oncologists, but there's an extra PI that is managed by the CRO that manages decentralized clinical trials and has them, be monitored from a nurse who goes to the patient's home, and they also do home phlebotomies and do all kind of testing. What we need is an engine to make sure that we get those patients activated at the site. Was one of my passions. So that's one of my disclosures there is that I want to help patients as much as possible with those studies because that's the way of the future, how we can get those patients enrolled.
So so we talk about virtual platforms and utilizing those, but they themselves have created other issues. So using virtual has created its own disparity, meaning not everybody has access, not everybody's comfortable using virtual. So we've created a disparity between the older and the younger population, the socioeconomic patients who can afford and can't afford. How do we then, utilizing this technology, address all of this on the front end so that everybody gets equal access? Jason, Dr. Porter, do you want to address that?
A lot of things we can provide to the patients, including training on how to do, these things. And just like we talked about overcoming the barrier, the cultural barriers, all of those things earlier, when you're enrolling in a trial, we're going to sit you down and go through how to use the iPad. Just give them an iPad, let them take it home. It's going to have to be one that's already connected to a carrier instead of home Wi-Fi, because home Wi-Fi is not always available, and we know that. But really, for the amount of money that we would end up spending on that, is it worth the investment? I think absolutely so. We'll get our questions answered faster. We'll move towards drug approvals faster. So it's really just going to be a matter of sitting down, and if that patient is, elderly and not able to do those things, maybe I had a patient last week who couldn't use the iPad to fill out the review systems that we do in our clinic because he couldn't read. But our front desk staff sat there with him and they went through the questions with him one at a time and helped him get so identifying a person, if not, someone in the clinic, obviously, but somebody at home, a neighbor, a friend, a grandchild, who can help that patient. And, it takes time. The visits are going to be a little bit longer initially while you make sure that person's able to participate fully. But I think these are easier to overcome than some of our previous challenges, So I can see already the disparities coming in, because like I said, some of those patients can't even read let alone use an iPad or don't have a computer at home. So just making sure that they're equipped with the things that they need. And it could be just as simple as giving them an iPhone. You know, they don't have to have an iPad or a laptop, but giving them an iPhone so that they can do a virtual visit, and just sending them home with that, and giving them a little bit of training. It's not that hard. I think we could do it for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Dorff. Any comment on that?
No, I kind of felt like I got punched in the gut when you raised that this creates more disparities, because it is true. I mean, we saw that with COVID and education and the lack of having computers or Wi-Fi, you know. So the study can provide a lot. It can provide a lot of education, as Dr. Porter's suggesting, and even devices, but there's no Wi-Fi. So you're right, there are additional challenges, but I think there's not going to be one solution that addresses all the issues. And I think for some populations that are really just excluded because they live too far away, or like I said earlier, I have patients who are working or caring for someone who's sick, and they can only participate if we reduce the burden of the number of visits. So I think technology can be part of the solution.
Thank you. All right, so we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to give you guys opportunity for parting words to the audience on diversity in clinical trial. Where do you see we're going, and what would your recommendation be? Dr. Loaiza-Bonilla, do you want to go first? 2 minutes.
Sure. No,
Less than 2 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, no, we highlighted all the problems. There's a lot of solutions that we can work on. I mean, if we can bring, Starlink from Elon Musk with internet to the middle of Africa, we can probably help our own, families here to get access to the internet by giving them a full, mobile phone or whatnot. So I think that the future is bright. We just need to be smart and understand that allocation of that budget, it's already there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to be creative. So to me, is all about access, making sure that people understand clinical trials. We need to believe the clinical trial is the way to the future, so everyone's on board. And join initiatives. So I have a personal one. I co-founded a company called Massive Bio, and we help patients to match to clinical trials for free. So that's my only thing I'm going to put here. So any patient that needs help needs to get that kind of initiative. There's other companies that actually do the centralized clinical trials. We need to convince the sponsors to use the money and technology to help everyone. So that's the call to action.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it here. I want to encourage the audience. We know we had a little technical difficulty. I think we may have figured it out. But I want to encourage you to join tomorrow. We're going to talk about sort of diversity in clinical care as a whole. And on the third day, really fireside chat with advocates, healthcare professionals. Thank you very much, guys, and really appreciate, and thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Good night.
much.